if you have not checked me out on Instagram or have not checked out my Patreon page yet, I do encourage you to do that because you will find some new things popping up there every once in a while, and the links will be in the description box down below. Now, I'm going to tell you about a case that I really want to hear your opinions on. Most people do not comment in the boxes below about what they think, and I would love that if you did, because I kind of want to know if your thoughts are close to mine. Some of you do, and I love that, and I recognize your names, and I look for your comments, especially if you try to comment on most of my videos. I know who you are, and I see you, and thank you for seeing me. But let's get right into this. So we are going to talk about the Fandel children. This is another one that just absolutely blows my mind because it is literally like they just went poof, and it doesn't make any sense. So, Scott Fandel, age 12, and his sister Amy, age 8, were reported missing the afternoon of September 6th, 1978. We appear to be stuck in the 70s now instead of the 60s here on the Geekers channel. Anyway, Scott was a high-spirited prankster who was known to entertain his classmates by eating bugs for money. Amy was an adorable, flaxen-haired imp whose smile was as big as the state of Alaska, which is where she and Scott lived. The Fandel children lived in a 2-room log cabin in the town of Sterling with their mother, Margaret, who's described as a petite beauty, and she was employed as a waitress in the Italian Gardens restaurant, which sounds really yummy, but I love pasta, so I'm so fluffy. Scott and Amy's father, Roger, had recently decamped to Arizona after a tumultuous decade-long marriage to Margaret. He'd moved out of the home in January, and Margaret did not flourish in Roger's absence. She was forced to work long hours to provide for her kids, and set adrift by her husband's departure, she soon began to crack under pressure. Although she was a good and loving mother, she was known to be kind of flighty. Her loneliness led her to befriend some rather unsavory characters, and on at least one occasion, Margaret allowed traveling carnival folk to spend the night in the home that she shared with her children, which is very unsafe, I think. On September 5th, her sister Kathy Schoenfelder arrived from good old Illinois. Kathy planned to live with the Fandels and obtain employment with Margaret at the Italian Gardens restaurant. I wonder if my sister would move to Alaska to be with me from Illinois. I would never move to Alaska. I will never move any further north than I am right now. I'm very sorry that I'm fidgety, but I just filmed Ted Part 3 and 4 and I really need to get up. Scott noted in his journal the day of Kathy's arrival that he kept the journal at school. Sorry, my notes are all mixed up. Today at 3:30, an aunt of mine is coming to live with us, and she's going to live with us for the rest of her life, he wrote. In retrospect, there's something poignant about his use of the rest of her life. Aunt Kathy may have been intended to stay in Alaska for the rest of her life, but her niece and nephew would spend less than one full day in her presence. After Kathy's arrival, the family visited an establishment called Good Time Charlie's. It was a local saloon/video game arcade, and after a pleasant and uneventful evening, Margaret drove Scott and Amy home. At approximately around 10:30, she and Kathy planned to visit a friend at a hotel in Kenai, a town approximately 30 minutes from Sterling. As Margaret watched her children enter the cabin, she couldn't possibly fathom that this was the last time she would see them. How many times has she replayed this scenario in her mind and forced herself to get out of the car and follow Scott and Amy in actually beaten a well-worn path between the two dwellings. So after Margaret deposited the children at the cabin, Scott and Amy ambled over to the Luptons for a late-night visit. Unfortunately, the children's roughhousing eventually became too rough, and when the beds were converted into trampolines, Mrs. Lupton suggested that maybe the Fandel children should return home. And this is where the known history of Scott and Amy end. They departed the Luptons' hut and were swallowed up by the great unknown. Margaret and Kathy came home between 2 and 3 a.m. They never found their friend in Kenai and instead spent the remainder of the evening at 2 local watering holes. When they came home and entered the cabin, Scott and Amy were not there, but a pot of water was found boiling on the stove, and the makings of spaghetti dinner lay on the counter. Plagued by the bottomless appetite of adolescence, Scott often cooked himself a second dinner before bedtime, so Margaret and Kathy were not troubled by their absences. They assumed that the children were spending the night with the Lupton family, as they had done so many times before, which makes sense, except for the fact that they left in the middle of cooking. That doesn't make sense to me. Does that not set off your alarm? Anyway, okay. Although this laissez-faire attitude may seem reckless in hindsight, crime wasn't much of a concern in Sterling in 1978. The front door of the cabin even lacked a working lock. Margaret woke up at 8:30 and she departed for her shift at the Italian Gardens. Still untroubled by Scott and Amy's absence, she assumed that they left for school directly from the Luptons. Margaret's first inkling of trouble actually occurred when she wasn't able to reach Amy via the school's telephone. At this point, she attempted to leave work to investigate, but her boss insisted that she stay and finish her shift, which I would not have done. After school, the Lupton children showed up at the Fandel cabin looking for Scott and Amy. Upon learning from the Luptons that they had not seen her niece and nephew since the previous evening, Kathy immediately contacted Margaret, who is still at work, and relayed the alarming news. Her worst fears were confirmed, and a panic-stricken Margaret then phoned the police, he was antagonized by the detectives' dogged queries and their repeated accusations that he had engineered the abduction of his children. We have our traditional airplane, ladies and gentlemen. Roger's animosity towards law enforcement caused him to stonewall investigators, which actually spurned further suspicion on the part of detectives. As years passed and continued investigation failed to disclose any evidence of his involvement, police eventually began to believe that Roger was in no way responsible for their disappearance. So, they hadn't run away or been kidnapped in a parental abduction. So, where are they? One by one, leads flickered briefly, bright sparks in the darkness, and then they quickly petered out. Someone had seen a black sedan speeding out of the neighborhood on the night in question. The car resembled an automobile that was used by one of the carnival friends, but the alibis appeared sound. At one of the bars where Margaret and Kathy visited, after dropping off the kids, they had been introduced to Alaska's most infamous adult entertainment purveyor. To police, this meeting seemed unlikely, an unlikely coincidence, but detectives were ultimately unable to find any evidence to support this guy's involvement in their abduction. Rumors circulated around town that the children had been snatched for sacrifice by Satanists, or rescued by do-gooders offended by Margaret's crappy parenting and crazy lifestyle. The police, increasingly desperate, never found any evidence to substantiate any of this. In fact, they never found any evidence at all. As the years turned to decades and a new century dawned, the people who loved Scott and Amy worried and wondered. A lot of web sleuthers also commented on Margaret's perceived bad choices that night. She left her children alone in a home that did not have locking mechanisms. She did not confirm their whereabouts when she got home. She did not immediately leave work when she finds out that they weren't at school. Now me, I have to wonder if that's just truly bad parenting or a sign of a different time. I mean, kids were not magically safer back then. It just seemed that way. It was an age without constant Amber Alerts and 24/7 news of us being scared to death about serial killers like Ted Bundy, which he was very active in this time. They lived in a rural area, and I'm sure that spending the night with neighbors was something that they did all the time. But on the other hand, after 4 or 5 hours at the bar, she was probably pretty significantly intoxicated and maybe a bit neglectful, but the aunt was also there, and I probably would have checked on the kids after I found a pot of boiling water on the stove at 3 a.m. Now, this leads me to the first theory that I'm going to talk about. All reports of what happened that night and the next day come from Margaret and Kathy. What if they did something to the kids? Maybe she called the school to make it seem like she didn't know where they were. Chris Watts just did the same thing. Maybe the pasta on the stove never existed. Maybe she was trying to frame Roger. I don't know that this is really what happened, but really, would it surprise you? The kids could have left on their own, but I don't think that they did that because, again, I think he would have taken the motorcycle and they would have turned up eventually. They were 12 and 8. Maybe they heard something outside and went outside to look around and then got lost in the woods. Or maybe somebody made a noise outside so the kids would go investigate. Maybe Scott was cooking dinner and realized that he didn't have any noodles, and he went to go. I don't know if there were noodles on the counter. When they said making spaghetti dinner, I couldn't really find out exactly what it. So maybe he went to borrow them from the Luptons and got ambushed on the walk back. So, of course, the most widely circulated theory is that Roger or his family took the kids. They were reportedly a pretty dangerous group of people, but if they took them to raise them, where are they? They usually, when a non-custodial parental figure takes a child, they usually take them to raise them, to live with him elsewhere. And they knew where Roger was, and he didn't have the kids. So, did his sisters, aunts, uncles, brother have them? That doesn't make, it's the same thing as your ex-wife having them in Alaska, except maybe they're closer, but you would have had to enroll them in school or something. Anyway, what was the motive in that? Revenge? From everything that I read, their divorce seemed pretty friendly. I don't know. I read that Roger was not actually Scott's biological father. So, potentially, maybe it could have been whoever that guy was, but why would he take Amy too? He reportedly had no interest in being in Scott's life, so what would make him show up after 12 years and decide that he then wanted to be, and then add an additional child? Anyway, they obviously easily got into the home because there were no locking mechanisms, but again, if that was the case, I feel like there would have been some kind of a struggle. My last theory kind of ties in with the second one. They could have been kidnapped by someone who was not part of either family. If a complete stranger had just happened upon their cabin, they probably surprised Scott while he was making his midnight stack. But I think that it is most likely someone who was at least known to the family that took the children. I hope that was not loud. Anyone associated with Margaret who even vaguely knew where she lived could have seen her, overheard her at the bar, and known that the kids were home alone. They could have taken advantage of that and gone to the house. They wouldn't have had a problem getting inside because at least the kids would have recognized their faces. Perhaps they said, hey, your mom's sick, we need to go to the hospital, and that's why Scott abandoned his snack mid-preparation. I think the lack of struggle and abandonment of a snack means they left in a hurry. I think that someone somewhere knows what happened, and I hope that whoever it is eventually comes forward. But I think that probably if they were gonna say something, they would have said something by now. I am increasingly sorry that this case is very short, but I wanted to give you something other than Ted Bundy, and I really thought that this was very interesting.